The spring of 1945 inches Europe was a time of both triumph and tension. Across the continent, cities lay in ruins, their streets scarred by years of relentless warfare. The once proud capitals of Germany were reduced to rubble, smoke rising from bombed-out factories and shattered apartment blocks. Millions had died, and yet, amidst the devastation, a fragile sense of victory hung in the air. The Allies had finally achieved what had seemed impossible just years before. Germany had surrendered. The guns were quiet. The war in Europe was over, or so it seemed. But behind the scenes of celebration, a quiet storm was brewing, one that would set the stage for a conflict that no one could yet imagine. President Harry S. Truman, who had just assumed the mantle of leadership after Franklin D. Roosevelt's sudden death, faced a world still at war with Japan, but increasingly divided by suspicion, ideology, and ambition. Among the pressing decisions on his desk was one that would shock even his closest allies: the abrupt termination of the Lend-Lease program to the Soviet Union. For years, Lend-Lease had been the lifeline of the Soviet war effort. Trucks, tanks, planes, and food all flowing from American factories to the Eastern Front. Stalin had depended on it, perhaps more than he would ever openly admit. Every shipment had helped keep the Red Army moving. Every crate of supplies had enabled the Soviets to strike back against the Germans and push relentlessly toward Berlin. And now, suddenly, it was to end. The decision was made almost overnight. On the 8th of May 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The very next day, Truman informed Congress that Lend-Lease would be terminated immediately. There would be no transitional period, no gradual phase-out. For Stalin, the news was nothing short of shocking. He saw it not merely as an administrative choice, but as a declaration. To him, the halt in aid was a signal. The United States would no longer be a friend in the looming post-war struggle. Some historians argue that Stalin likened it to a declaration of war, though not in the sense of tanks rolling or bombs falling, but in a subtler, more strategic way, the kind that shaped the world order for decades to come. The rationale behind Truman's decision was rooted in both principle and pragmatism. The American public, weary of war and anxious to return to peacetime normalcy, was clamoring for a reduction in foreign expenditures. The U.S. economy, though booming in wartime production, faced inflationary pressures and shortages in consumer goods. Politicians in Washington argued that the Lend-Lease program had served its purpose. Europe was liberated, Germany defeated, and it was time to focus on rebuilding American industry and caring for the millions of veterans returning home. But the consequences of that choice were immediate and far-reaching. Stalin's response was carefully measured but undeniably hostile. The Soviet leader had spent years negotiating with Roosevelt, sometimes in frustration, sometimes in gratitude, over the flow of supplies that had kept his forces from collapsing. Now, with Truman's swift cutoff, he was forced to confront the stark reality that the United States and the Soviet Union would not simply be allies in the New World Order, they would be competitors, even adversaries. Even in Washington, the decision was controversial. Some advisors warned that abrupt action would antagonize Moscow at a critical moment, when American and Soviet forces still shared the spoils of victory across a devastated Europe. Others, however, believed that the time for careful diplomacy had passed, that the United States had carried the weight of Allied victory long enough, and that economic and political self-interest demanded a firm stance. Truman, confident in his judgment and determined to assert American authority, moved decisively. The timing of the decision added to the drama. The surrender of Germany marked a symbolic turning point, a moment when the world seemed poised for hope and reconstruction. Yet, in a single stroke, the Lend-Lease termination injected tension into the fragile alliance that had defeated Hitler. Stalin, already suspicious of Western intentions, perceived the action as a subtle challenge to Soviet power and influence in Eastern Europe. Every truck not sent, every shipment cancelled, became a symbol of mistrust and strategic maneuvering. At the same time, the move highlighted the growing differences in American and Soviet visions for the post-war world. The United States, with its industrial might and democratic institutions, sought to promote stability and capitalism, to encourage reconstruction under the Marshall Plan and friendly governments. The Soviet Union, battered by the war but determined to secure its borders, aimed to create a buffer zone of influence across Eastern Europe. Lend-Lease had been more than just material support. It had been a bridge of cooperation, a symbol that the two powers could work together despite ideological differences. By cutting it off abruptly, Truman signaled that bridge was no longer guaranteed. Historians have long debated Truman's motives. Some argue it was a purely domestic decision, responding to political pressure and economic necessity. Others suggest it was a calculated diplomatic move, an early assertion of American influence as the Cold War quietly emerged from the ashes of global conflict. Perhaps it was both a mixture of practical concerns and strategic foresight, wrapped in the urgency of a moment that would define international relations for the next half-century. In the shadowed halls of the Kremlin, the news traveled swiftly. Stalin read the message, carefully noting its tone and timing. Reports suggest he paused, staring at the telegraph or cable that bore the American decision, weighing its implications. The Red Army, which had fought and suffered more than any other Allied force, had relied heavily on American aid. Its sudden absence was a blow not just to logistics, but to trust and expectation. Stalin, already wary of Western intentions, now faced a choice: to accept this new reality or to respond with force, influence, or both. This decision, made in a quiet office far from the battlefields, would echo across the post-war world. The end of Lend-Lease did not ignite immediate conflict, but it sowed the seeds of suspicion and rivalry. It framed the conversation for decades to come, shaping the early contours of the Cold War and altering the dynamics between two superpowers emerging from the crucible of total war. To understand why Truman acted as he did, and why Stalin perceived it as a threat, we must look deeper into the story of Lend-Lease itself, its origins, its execution, and the immense toll it took on both sides of the Atlantic. This is the story of how a program designed to keep allies alive became, in its abrupt end, a spark that hinted at the next global confrontation. The story of Lend-Lease is, in many ways, a story of extraordinary effort, ingenuity, and sacrifice. When Roosevelt first proposed the program in 1941, the United States was still technically neutral, and the world was engulfed in flames. Britain was fighting alone against Hitler's seemingly unstoppable war machine, and the Soviet Union had been brutally invaded by Germany's forces. Roosevelt saw the stakes clearly. If the Allies were to survive, they would need American industry, American resources, and American determination. Factories across the United States roared to life. Tanks rolled off assembly lines, aircraft were built at a pace never before seen, and shipments of food, fuel, and medical supplies were organized with meticulous care. Every crate and container sent across the Atlantic represented hope, not just for soldiers on the front lines, but for millions of civilians struggling to survive under occupation. For the Soviets, Lend-Lease was a lifeline. It kept trains running, troops fed, and armor moving in the face of German offensives that threatened to crush Moscow itself. By the time Truman assumed the presidency in April 1945, Lend-Lease had been in operation for nearly 4 years. Hundreds of thousands of vehicles had been delivered to the Soviets. Millions of tons of raw materials, ammunition, and food had crossed oceans under constant threat from German U-boats. The Red Army, which bore the brunt of Hitler's aggression, had relied heavily on these supplies to maintain momentum in the final push toward Berlin. Yet, for Truman, the program had become a political and economic burden. American factories were exhausted, Congress demanded austerity, and a nation eager for peace was growing impatient. The decision to end Lend-Lease immediately after Germany's surrender was not a simple administrative choice, it was a statement of intent. The timing was deliberate, calculated to coincide with a symbolic moment: the end of the European War. In Truman's mind, the defeat of Germany marked a turning point. The Soviet Union no longer required the same level of support to continue the fight against Japan, and the United States could shift its resources to peacetime priorities and the looming war in the Pacific. But in Moscow, the timing was interpreted very differently. Stalin had suffered unimaginable losses, tens of millions of Soviet citizens dead, cities destroyed, and an economy in ruins. Lend-Lease had been a guarantee, a steady hand guiding the Soviet war machine through its darkest hours. Its sudden termination felt like a betrayal, a cold reminder that America's friendship had limits. Some accounts suggest that Stalin saw the move as a deliberate provocation, an early maneuver in a global game of power that was only just beginning. The American decision also carried a subtle, but powerful, message to Europe. By ending Lend-Lease, the United States signaled that it would not indefinitely support Soviet expansion or dominance. It was an assertion of control, a way to frame the post-war economic and political landscape. Truman's advisors argued that Europe could no longer rely on endless American aid. The continent would have to rebuild, with its own resources, and under the influence of whichever power was willing and able to guide reconstruction. Despite its immediate impact, the decision was quietly controversial. Some officials in Washington feared that cutting off aid so abruptly would push the Soviets toward hostility or even retaliation. Yet Truman's administration justified the move as necessary for fiscal responsibility and national security. The Lend-Lease program, while invaluable during the war, had become a potential liability. The United States was emerging as a global superpower, and Truman believed that its influence would be stronger if it projected confidence and self-interest rather than dependency. Behind the scenes, the mechanics of ending the program were swift and thorough. Contracts were cancelled, shipments halted, and logistics networks reoriented. The factories that had churned out endless waves of supplies now shifted focus toward domestic production and preparing for the Pacific Theater. For the Soviet Union, the abrupt cessation of aid created immediate logistical challenges. Spare parts for vehicles, fuel for tanks, and even basic food supplies were suddenly in short supply. The Red Army could continue its advance into Eastern Europe, but it would have to do so without the cushion of American support it had come to rely upon. The response from Stalin was careful, calculated, and strategic. Publicly, he maintained a veneer of calm, acknowledging the end of Lend-Lease without overt aggression. Privately, however, it was a warning sign. The United States could no longer be counted on as a partner in shaping post-war Europe. Soviet intelligence reports and diplomatic cables from this period reveal the tension building in Moscow. Stalin was already plotting how to secure influence over Eastern Europe, how to create buffer states, and how to assert Soviet power in a world increasingly dominated by American industrial and economic might. Interestingly, the abrupt end of Lend-Lease also forced the Soviets to innovate. They had to develop new supply lines, repurpose captured equipment, and rely more heavily on domestic production. This adaptation, born of necessity, strengthened the Soviet military-industrial complex in ways that would shape its capabilities for decades. But the initial shock of losing American support was undeniable. It left Stalin wary, suspicious, and deeply conscious of the fragile balance of power between the two nations. Meanwhile, in Washington, the Lend-Lease decision was framed as a logical, even moral choice. American newspapers celebrated the end of the program as a sign of national strength and prudence. Politicians spoke of victory, self-reliance, and the need to protect American interests. Few understood, or perhaps few wanted to acknowledge, the simmering tension it created on the other side of the globe. What appeared to Americans as a routine administrative decision was, in Moscow, a signal that the era of unconditional wartime alliance had ended, and the era of competition had begun. This period also revealed the stark differences in worldview between Truman and Stalin. Truman approached the post-war world through the lens of democracy, capitalism, and open markets. He believed that economic independence and the projection of American influence were essential for global stability. Stalin, on the other hand, saw the world through the lens of security, survival, and ideological expansion. Lend-Lease had been a tool of necessity, but its abrupt end exposed the growing ideological divide, the fault lines along which the Cold War would erupt. In hindsight, the decision seems almost prophetic. It foreshadowed the tense standoff of Berlin, the nuclear brinkmanship of the 1950 seconds, and the decades-long struggle for influence across the globe. A single administrative act, the termination of a supply program, became a spark in the tinderbox of post-war diplomacy. It reminded the world that victory in war does not automatically translate to trust in peace, and that even allies can quickly become rivals when interests diverge. As the summer of 1945 progressed, the implications of the decision became clearer. American factories were refocused, soldiers began returning home, and Europe faced the monumental task of reconstruction. Yet, across the continent, in cities still smoldering from the war, diplomats, generals, and leaders watched closely as Washington and Moscow navigated this new reality. Lend-Lease had ended, and with it, a fragile bridge of cooperation. What replaced it would define the shape of global politics for generations. The abrupt end of Lend-Lease did more than just stop shipments of tanks, trucks, and food. It cracked open a fissure in the fragile alliance that had defeated Hitler, a fissure that would widen into the Cold War. For Stalin, the message was clear. The United States was no longer a partner to be relied upon, but a rival whose intentions must be questioned and countered. Behind the ornate halls of the Kremlin, plans were set into motion not for immediate war, but for influence, control, and the establishment of security zones across Eastern Europe. The Soviets would no longer depend on foreign aid. They would depend on themselves, and on the fear they could instill in the post-war world. Truman, meanwhile, moved with confidence, believing that America had the moral and economic upper hand. By ending Lend-Lease, he not only curtailed unnecessary expenditure but also sent a signal to Congress, to the public, and to allies that the United States was stepping firmly into a new role. The war in Europe was over, but a new kind of struggle had begun, one fought not with guns, but with politics, ideology, and the leverage of economic and military might. Across the Atlantic, in Moscow, the reaction was swift, though measured. Stalin did not lash out immediately. He knew that outright confrontation with America was unwise. Instead, he began the careful orchestration of influence, setting the stage for a post-war Eastern Europe dominated by Soviet power. Satellite states would emerge, governments aligned with Moscow installed, and military presence subtly expanded. Lend-Lease may have ended, but the realignment of power was just beginning. And Stalin viewed the cessation as both a threat and an opportunity, a warning that the Western allies were no longer guarantors of Soviet survival. In the United States, the decision was largely celebrated as pragmatic and decisive. Americans were weary of war, eager for reconstruction, and proud of the nation's unprecedented industrial output. Ending Lend-Lease allowed factories to shift focus, shipping routes to be repurposed, and budgets to be rebalanced. Soldiers could return home, goods could flow to American families, and the economy could transition from war footing to peacetime growth. Yet, beneath this sense of triumph lay the subtle, simmering tension that few fully understood at the time. Historians looking back recognize that Truman's move was more than administrative, it was symbolic. It marked the end of the wartime camaraderie that had held the Allies together under extraordinary circumstances. The personal rapport between Roosevelt and Stalin, which had allowed some degree of trust, could not survive Roosevelt's death. Truman, though confident and capable, was a different leader with different priorities, and his swift action reflected both the necessity of domestic politics and a strategic vision for American influence. By the late summer of 1945, the world was quietly shifting. Lend-Lease had ended, Germany lay in ruins, and the atomic bomb had ushered in a new era of power projection. Stalin, now fully aware that the United States was asserting itself as a global authority, began to solidify his post-war strategies. The cessation of aid had not led to immediate conflict, but it had created an environment of suspicion, competition, and calculated maneuvering. Every American decision, every diplomatic message, would now be interpreted through the lens of a potential adversary. The Lend-Lease decision also shaped the unfolding economic order. Europe, devastated by years of war, could not simply rebuild itself without assistance, and the United States was poised to influence the reconstruction. The Marshall Plan, which would emerge later, reflected this new approach. Aid would be conditional, strategic, and aimed at stabilizing regions in a way that aligned with American interests. Lend-Lease had been unconditional and urgent. Its end signaled that future assistance would be carefully calibrated to serve not just humanitarian goals, but also geopolitical objectives. For Stalin, the implications went beyond logistics and economics. The abrupt termination of aid reinforced a worldview in which survival depended on control and influence. The Soviet Union would no longer gamble on goodwill or untested alliances. It would secure its borders, dominate its neighbors, and invest heavily in self-sufficiency. The seeds of the Iron Curtain, the division between East and West, had been planted not just by ideology, but by the tangible act of cutting off the lifeline that had kept the Red Army moving for years. In the United States, few realized at the time the full impact of the decision. Lend-Lease was a story of logistics, economics, and wartime necessity, but its abrupt conclusion sent ripples across the geopolitical landscape. It forced the Soviets to adapt, it signaled a new era of American power, and it marked the beginning of a rivalry that would dominate the latter half of the 20th century. A single administrative action, made in the shadow of victory celebrations, had altered the course of global history. The end of Lend-Lease was more than a policy choice, it was a statement of intent, a harbinger of the Cold War, and a testament to the delicate balance of trust and suspicion that defines international relations. For Stalin, it was a warning. For Truman, it was a bold assertion of American authority. And for the world, it was a signal that even allies could become competitors in the fragile peace after total war. As Europe began to pick itself up from the ashes, as soldiers returned home, and as nations faced the monumental task of rebuilding, the shadow of that single decision loomed large. Lend-Lease had ended, and with it, the era of unconditional wartime alliance. What replaced it was a world defined by caution, competition, and the subtle, pervasive tension that would come to define the Cold War. In the end, Truman's choice to cut off Lend-Lease the day after Germany surrendered was a pivot point in history, a moment where practical policy, domestic politics, and emerging global strategy converged. It was a reminder that victory in war does not automatically bring harmony and peace, and that the relationships forged under the pressures of combat can unravel in an instant when priorities shift and ambitions clash. The story of Lend-Lease's abrupt end is, ultimately, a story of power, perception, and the fragile nature of trust. It reminds us that history is shaped as much by the decisions made in quiet offices as by the battles fought on blood-soaked fields. And as the world moved forward into a tense, uncertain future, the echoes of that decision resonated, shaping the alliances, rivalries, and conflicts that would define generations to come.